It's my joy and pleasure to introduce you to Georgette Bennett, who will be our discussant today. Georgette is the president and founder of the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding in New York. She's also the founder of the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees, which was founded in 2013 in response to the Syrian civil war, if we want to call it a civil war, and helping out the war victims who are there. Georgette's had an amazing career. She was a television journalist, a broadcast journalist with NBC, 60 Minutes, 2020. She got her PhD in sociology, and then she married Rabbi Marc Tannenbaum, who we'll be talking about today as well. She's written 4 books, including her book in 1987, Crime Warps: The Future of Crime in America, that was nominated for a Pulitzer. And she is now one of America's preeminent interfaith leaders, and she's been doing this work for about 30 years now. So we're pleased to have her with us. Today, we're actually going to be talking about this book. It was in the slideshow for those who signed on a little early, and we'll put the link into the chat there as well if you have not already purchased it. The book is called Confronting Hate: The Untold Story of the Rabbi Who Stood Up for Human Rights, Racial Justice, and Religious Reconciliation. And it is a biography of Rabbi Marc Tannenbaum, Georgette's late husband. So let me give a very brief introduction to Marc, and then we're gonna let Georgette introduce us much more to his life and his legacy. So Rabbi Marc Tannenbaum was born and raised here in Baltimore, and I'm eager to hear some stories about that. He attended the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he studied under and became lifelong friends with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Marc was an interfaith pioneer. He's especially active in working and healing some of the disconnect between and the grievances really between Christians and Jews. He was an advocate during the Second Vatican Council for the Roman Catholic Church, and helped along the process to bring about the declaration that we know as Nostra Aetate, the Catholic Church's position on all the world religions, but especially in conversation with Judaism. And he was also a great civil rights leader, a key mover and shaker in the 1960s, friends with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. So we're excited to explore all of this legacy and all of this. So thank you, Georgette, for being with us today. We're very grateful for your time and your presence here.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. Thank you for inviting me to lunch in Marc's hometown. It's
great to have you.
It's a very nice place to be, even virtually, and thank you so much for organizing this program and introducing your people to this book, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you.
Great. So for all of you who are participating and joining us virtually, we're going to have space for you to ask some questions and post some questions to Georgette towards the end of our time here. So if you have questions as they come up at any point during this, feel free to put those into the chat, and we'll come to those towards the end. We're going to keep everyone else on mute for the time being. So Georgette, let's start with Baltimore. So Marc, as I mentioned, was born and raised here, and he still has family here. I believe that some of his family members are even joining us on this call.
Some of them are there. I saw them.
So can you help us understand the Baltimore that Marc grew up in, that may be different from the Baltimore that we experience today? And what impact did Baltimore have on his career, on his view of the world, and on his approach to interfaith relations?
Well, it had a very great impact. So Marc was born in 1925, and his parents were both immigrants from the Ukraine. Now, of course, I wasn't around then, but I have the impression that Baltimore was very much of an immigrant city. And Marc and his family lived at 1850 Light Street. And that's certainly an area where there's a tremendous contrast between Baltimore then and Baltimore now. 1850 Light Street is now in the relatively newly gentrified Inner Harbor area. But Marc held on to those numbers, 1850, the metal numbers from his home, and kept them on his desk, literally, until he died. So Baltimore was always with him. Now, the neighborhood where this Orthodox Jewish family lived was a neighborhood primarily of Irish, Italian, German, mostly Christian immigrants. And the reason that they were living in that mostly Christian neighborhood was because his father was certain that if they got a grocery store on this particular street corner, 1850 Light Street, they literally lived above the store. He was sure that the streetcar stop was going to be built there. So they kept waiting for the streetcar. That never came. But that's why they were in that neighborhood. They had a grocery store. And of course, they lived there during the Depression. And one day when Marc went down to the store and happened to open the cash register, he found a single quarter in it. That's all that was in the cash register. And that's something else that never left him, the Depression and its lessons. But you might ask the question, how does the son of Orthodox Jewish immigrants make it his life's mission to build bridges among the great religions of the world? And I think that was driven by two things, two experiences. On the one hand, he would be told about an uncle of his who was killed in the Ukraine. And the way he was killed was that after an Easter sermon, which so inflamed the congregation in this church, that when they came out of church after that Easter sermon, and of course we know what the deicide charge is against the Jews, they picked the first Jew they came across and forced him into the Bug River until he drowned. So he had this story about his uncle who had been killed by good Christians. The other thing that was every Christmas, even though they were impoverished, the Tannenbaum family, his mother would pack up baskets of food for all their Christian neighbors. And she would take Marc by the hand and they would walk down the street dropping off these baskets. Now, having heard about this uncle of his who was killed by Christians coming out of an Easter service, he asked his mother, why are we bringing food to these people? And his mother said to him, because our neighbors can't be without food on their big holiday. So those were the two poles of what eventually became his career in interreligious relations.
And even the endless deferral of public transit in Baltimore is a through line we can trace all the way back to the Depression.
Right. So life would have been different if only the streetcar stopped there.
So that really, I think that gives a great background for the way that Marc kind of thought about his own Jewish identity and advocacy for Jewish people, not only in America, but around the world, but then also as he thought about healing this divide, healing the rift between Christians and Jews. We're living in a crazy moment, Georgette, where you have the global pandemic.
Really?
Yes.
Really,
yes.
I hadn't heard.
we have a global pandemic, the political disorder, rising anti-Semitism, rising Islamophobia, and many people have in trying to even find some historical analogy for right now, have looked back to the 1960s and to the time when really Marc was at the height of his career, bringing about some of these great changes. Can you tell us a little bit about what was his approach to interfaith relations? And once we kind of get that baseline, how do you think he would approach building bridges with people who are religiously different in a time like this?
Yeah, I don't think he would approach it very differently from the way he approached it then, because the techniques that Marc used in his day, and of course he died in 1992, are completely relevant for the toxic environment in which we're living today. So Marc was very quick to call out anti-Semitism or any form of bigotry, but he was very slow to accuse any individual of being an anti-Semite or a bigot. He formed multi-faith coalitions to address key issues. Multi-faith coalitions around common interests. Obviously, there were big differences among the various religious communities that were parts of these coalitions, but they made common cause around key issues. And in his time, that would have been refugees and Soviet Jewry, the civil rights movement, certainly, pornography, interestingly enough. Today, the issues are largely the same. We don't seem to be as worried about pornography, but refugees, demonization of Muslims, discrimination against the LGBTQ community, people of color, Jews, Muslims, Antifa. So one way that he would have addressed this publicly, he made very good use of the media to amplify his message. He was pretty much a genius in terms of how to work with the media. So he would have called out the politics of purity that cause us to view the other as evil rather than someone who just happens to have a different point of view. He would have debunked myths with facts. Today, as I'm sure you all know, all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories have come out of this pandemic. And Marc would have addressed those conspiracy theories. But you can't just use facts. Facts are for policymakers. Facts don't seem to move the public that much. What you need to move the public is stories. So a lot of his messaging was done through his work on popular TV series. He was one of the people who worked on the TV series Holocaust, and he worked very closely with Vincenzo Labella on Jesus of Nazareth, which of course airs every single Easter. And because of Marc's work on that film, you really get a sense of the Jewish Jesus. And I can only imagine what Marc would have done if Facebook and Twitter had existed in his day. Well, of course, today we have people like Henry Louis Gates doing the same thing and Simon Schama doing the same thing with the extraordinary TV series that they do, which are very, very informative and certainly debunk a lot of myths, but it's done in the form of storytelling. He would have mobilized the moral authority of the clergy, and he would have challenged politicians' claims of piety if they behaved in ways that contradict the principles they claim to espouse. And of course, we see a great deal of this today. He would have listened deeply to the fears that underlie hate, and he would have spoken powerfully to address those fears. And let me give you an example of that. I recently had the opportunity to hear a former white supremacist explaining what it is about white supremacy that attracted him and that attracts so many others to the movement. He said there are three attractions, and they intertwine identity with ideology. Number one, he said, they gave me power when I felt powerless. They gave me visibility when I felt invisible. And they gave me community when I felt alone. So then the question was, how do you counter that? How do you deal with it? And he said you have to do curious listening, which is another word for the kind of deep listening that Marc did. And he's been able to deprogram a number of white supremacists because of doing that kind of deep listening, listening to their grievances. Now, that doesn't mean that we can explain away everything that they do and all of the ugly stuff in that ideology. But it's important to start with understanding it. What is it that they get out of this? And then, and this is very important, it's subtle, but he appreciated the constraints and the risks that were taken by the partners he worked with because they were working with him. And this was particularly evident in Vatican Council II.
Let me pick up right there then. So I did my PhD work at Georgetown, and I was there on the 50th anniversary of Vatican II and all these celebrations and commemorations. And I think so much of the time when we think about Vatican II, for those of us who even spend time thinking about it, us eggheads, we think about the outcomes of Vatican II, Nostra Aetate, and these great kind of documents, the shift that occurred in the Roman Catholic Church there in the 1960s. One of the things I found so fascinating reading the book is the way that you get this kind of insider-outsider account of Vatican II, right? Because Marc is an advocate and at different points an advisor working with these folks in the church, and all these different bishops and prelates. But then at the same time, he is pushing for the church to actually face up to some of the legacy and the history of anti-Semitism. And it's just seeing the politicking that's going on behind the scenes as these different groups are gathering. Can you tell us a little bit about how did Marc even get involved in the Second Vatican Council? And what was his role in this formation of Nostra Aetate as he understood it?
Well, that's a very, very, very long story, which takes up a number of chapters in the book, and I promise I won't go on that long. So Marc joined the American Jewish Committee in 1961. He had, before that, been president of the Synagogue Council of America, and that's where he actually began doing his interreligious work. Now, AJC had been addressing anti-Semitism in education through very important landmark, I would say, textbook studies, both of Catholic texts and Jewish texts. And they felt that they should be taking the initiative in terms of Vatican Council II when it was announced, because they really recognized, and Marc certainly recognized, the momentous potential that this council held for Catholic-Jewish relations. So AJC was invited to submit suggestions and to submit their research findings, but it was AJC's connection with the Prodeo University in Rome that really gave AJC and Marc access to the Vatican hierarchy. Marc then recruited Abraham Joshua Heschel as an esteemed Jewish voice to offer suggestions and to review documents. The role that Marc played was primarily a back channel role, and it had to be back channel because you could not have a rabbi, you could not have a Jew in the forefront of of trying to promulgate this text, which eventually became Nostra Aetate. So he provided research, and he identified these specific Catholic teachings and practices that needed to be modified in terms of the Jews. So there was no formal role, there was no single organization that was formally involved. Only rabbinic leaders were involved in the work that Marc did. No politics, no publicity. And the recommendations were couched in terms of human relations rather than a theological framework. We can pick up on that theme later. He published an article on the unhappy history of Catholic-Jewish relations, and he promoted Vatican Council II as an opportunity to reverse 1900 years of teachings, specifically the teaching of contempt against the Jews, and an opportunity for a vigorous condemnation of anti-Semitism. Now, as you alluded in your question, Matt, there was a lot of politics. The US Catholic bishops, for example, were very supportive, and they were pushing hard for this document, and there was very strong resistance from the Middle East bishops. And the reason that there was strong resistance, and this is a very interesting example of Marc appreciating the constraints and the risks being taken by the people with whom he worked. Christians in the Middle East were under threat, and the bishops were concerned, the Middle East bishops, that if this document turned out to be too conciliatory toward the Jews, that Christians were going to be even more persecuted, and possibly their lives would be in danger in Arab countries. So the Vatican was treading a very fine line. Now, it would have been very easy from the outside looking in to take your outside in, inside out point that you were making. From the outside looking in, it would have been very easy to shame the Vatican publicly, criticize it for how slowly this was moving along. And it was moving along very slowly because it was introduced very close to the beginning of the council, and it was the very last resolution that was acted upon years later at the end of the council. But Marc understood what the Vatican was having to deal with, the fine line it was having to tread. So in the end, Nostra Aetate was a watered down document. It was not strictly a declaration on the Jews, which it was originally intended to be, but it also encompassed other religions. But nevertheless, it was historic, and it was the launch pad for a tremendous reversal of Catholic Jewish history.
And yeah, and reading that part of the book, you really do. I mean, you get the text of these telegrams that are going back and forth between Cardinal Bea and Marc, and just the ways that there is this kind of conversation, a dialogue going on, right, where Marc and Abraham Joshua Heschel are advocating and pressing these kind of Catholic leaders at different points, but then also at times trying to even have dialogue with their own Jewish community. There was Jewish opposition.
That was more difficult. That was more difficult.
Right, because especially a number of Orthodox rabbis were very opposed to Marc and Heschel being involved in this at all. They thought this was an intra-Catholic conversation, and Marc, as I read the book, and his life and legacy, was very, within his own Jewish community, was an advocate for theological dialogue. He talks sometimes about Jews need to engage in God talk with
Mhm.
Christians and with other people of other religions. Can you talk
And
about that a little bit?
yeah,
What did he mean by God talk? And what role, I mean, this is something we encounter quite a bit at ICJS as well, right? That we all come in with our beliefs, our closely held values, but in interreligious encounter, we're bringing those and opening them up in a certain way to other communities. How did Marc think about both the goal and the experience of that God talk interreligious encounter?
yes. Well, as you implied, the Orthodox community was, at least publicly, um, very critical of Marc's efforts. And one of the reasons for that, in addition to the one you mentioned, was that they were completely opposed to discussing theology in the dialogue process. Now, Marc had to engage in theology and dialogue because the question that drove him, that kind of launched his work in Catholic Jewish and eventually evangelical Jewish relations, was this question: how could a gospel of love be such a gospel of hate when it comes to the Jews? Now, you can't answer that question without digging into the theological roots of the preaching of contempt against Jews. He also understood that there was widespread ignorance of Judaism and misunderstanding of Judaism. And Marc was an ambassador for Judaism. In fact, he was dubbed in one publication the Secretary of State for the Jews. Nostra Aetate focused on the deicide issue and the roots of Christianity in Hebrew scriptures. Well, those are theological issues. You can't escape them. Those are theological issues. But there was a distinction between the political question of the state of Israel and the religious question of Judaism and Christianity, especially in relation to those Arab prelates that I mentioned earlier. Now, as for the dialogue process itself, I think many people have a misunderstanding of dialogue and a fear of it, because their concern is that if you dialogue with adherents of other religions, it's going to dilute your own beliefs. But in fact, the opposite is true. Marc understood that the process of interpreting one's beliefs to others strengthens one's knowledge about one's own beliefs and reinforces one's loyalty to one's own religion, while at the same time respecting the other. So dialogue was a process that was individually transformative, but it's not something that has a lot of impact beyond the four walls where it's taking place. And Marc was also an activist. So the coalitions that he formed were the action component of his work. And we've been focusing only on Christian-Jewish relations, but Marc was also very early on in terms of outreach to the Muslim community. And were he alive today, he would have been very, very active in Muslim Jewish coalitions. And he also worked with Sikhs and with Hindus. But I think what made him famous was that pioneering work in terms of Christian-Jewish relations. But he was much more than that. He was an activist.
I think it's so interesting to kind of think about that role that he was playing as a coalition builder. I mean, Marc was the one who, there's that famous friendship between Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel. Marc was the one who actually introduced them at that conference on race and religion, which where Heschel gave the just famous, phenomenal speech. That coalition building is really hard. It's really difficult to do. I think we see that in our world today. I mean, many of us lament that we don't have something like the civil rights movement, at least not in any scale that we would recognize today. How did Marc approach that kind of coalitional, relational work that he was doing? And how do you think he would approach a time like ours? I just feel like there's so many causes, and the civil rights issues of our time they feel very scattershot and chaotic, and we don't have kind of the through line or narrative that I think really guided Heschel and King and Marc in many ways. So how do you think he would go about doing something like that today?
Well, we have to start with the Jewish values from which he drew. And there are several core values that really drove his work. Most important, the idea that Judaism contributed to civilization. It's one of its greatest contributions to civilization. The idea that each person is made in the sacred image of God and is therefore inherently worthy of dignity and respect. Then there was Leviticus 19:16, thou shalt not stand idly by while the blood of your neighbor cries out from the earth, the command to take action. Caring for the stranger, it's the reason he became so deeply involved in refugee issues. There are no fewer than 36 references in the Hebrew scriptures about caring for the stranger. There's only one reference to love thy neighbor as thyself. And that's because it's easy to love somebody who's like you. It's not so easy to love the stranger. So, as you said, he organized the first national conference on religion and race because, of course, there is an intersection between religion and race, and I think even more of an intersection today, because today when we think about people of color, it's not only African Americans who we're thinking of, it's also Asians, it's also Arabs. So that intersection between religion and race, as you said, that's where he introduced Martin Luther King to Heschel, and it was one of King's first national platforms, actually. In fact, after King died on what would have been his 50th birthday, Coretta Scott King invited Marc to preach at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Marc became very close to Bayard Rustin, the great civil rights leader, and talk about intersection. Bayard Rustin also came with Marc to Southeast Asia to deal with the Cambodian and Vietnamese refugees. Then there was Jesse Jackson, a very unfortunate episode with Jesse Jackson. Those of you who are my age or close who were participating in this meeting might remember the Hymietown episode, in which Jackson referred to New York City as Hymietown, meaning it's a Jewish city. Well, that created a huge uproar. But the way Marc approached that, and by the way, I think it's the same way he would approach the Ilhan Omar episode that we had a year or two ago. The way he approached it was not by shaming Jesse Jackson, but he invited him to a debate, which was held at Queens College in New York City as part of their people-to-people program. And that debate actually became an affirmation of the solidarity between Blacks and Jews. So I mentioned Ilhan Omar before, and you were asking about contemporary examples. So how would he approach it? So for one thing, he would not have jumped on Omar's sound bites. He would have looked at the totality of her statements. He would have been very quick to call out bigotry, but he would not be quick to call her a bigot. And just as he publicly engaged Jesse Jackson, he would have publicly engaged Ilhan Omar and used the controversy as an opportunity to build bridges instead of an opportunity to sow further division. Now, one of the things that made Omar's remarks so controversial was what she had to say about Israel. So I think that Marc would have applied Anatole Sharansky's 3D test to her remarks about Israel, rather than immediately equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And the 3D test is demonization, double standard, and delegitimization. Marc often applied this test, although Anatole Sharansky didn't act and really formalize it until years after Marc died. But Marc applied the same kind of standard rather than immediately equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Now, one of the big issues that we're confronting today is voter suppression and white supremacy. So how would Marc have addressed that? Well, he would have mobilized, again, as he always did, the moral authority of clergy across religious lines. He would have addressed the issue of religion in the public square, because we seem to have created out of religion a litmus test, a faith-based litmus test for holding public office. So since that has become a litmus test for holding public office, he would have held to account politicians who were claiming to be good Christians and good Muslims and good Jews and behaving in ways that neither Jesus nor Muhammad nor Moses would have recognized. He would have organized a national program with a heavy focus on media to debunk historical myths with series such as Henry Louis Gates's Reconstruction. He would have called out the moral equivalency of Charlottesville, and he would have supported the lawsuit that has been pending in that case, by the way, against the organizers of the neo-Nazis and white supremacists who marched that day. And that, in fact, has been a very effective lawsuit, because even before it's been ruled on and settled, it has already created tremendous financial problems for those white supremacy groups. It has deplatformed them from a lot of their platforms. And they weren't able to open a new building, for example, that they were planning to open. And should it be resolved in favor of the complainants, there will also be serious fines that have to be paid, just like, by the way, a tax audit put the Ku Klux Klan out of business decades ago. They're back.
They are indeed. Just for those in the audience, we're going to take in just a few minutes any of your questions. So feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll try to make space for those. I want to just ask one more question for you, Georgette. So you mentioned that Marc passed away in 1992, and you then created the Marc Tannenbaum Foundation, which then has now morphed or created the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, and you are the founder and president. I know you're still active with them. Can you talk a little bit about Marc's legacy? How have you and others kind of carried forward his work since his death, and how does that work continue today through the Tannenbaum Center and other places where you're involved?
Well, I was deeply inspired by Marc, and when after he died, just for a little bit of context, he died 7 weeks before our only child. Joshua Marc was born. So I was a new mother, and the last thing on a new mother without her husband. So the last thing that was on my mind was figuring out how to start a new not-for-profit. But after a couple of months, I had what can only be described as an epiphany, which is a strange word for a nice Jewish girl to be using. But it was an epiphany where I just realized that nothing that I had been doing with my career, and I had a very diverse, very interesting career, but that nothing that I had been doing with my career was as important as building on Marc's work. So I founded the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. I took his seat on the board of the International Rescue Committee, which got me very much involved with refugee issues. And as you mentioned, I then founded the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. I also co-founded the Global Covenant Partners, which was the umbrella for the Global Covenant of Religions. Now, when Marc was alive, I was still in my career as a criminologist, but I was always very interested in the link between religion and violence. And the mission of Global Covenant Partners was to delegitimize the use of religion as a reason for extremism and violence. In terms of my own personal journey, I'm also on the national board of the Inter-Muslim Jewish, I'm bad with acronyms, it's IJMA Alliance, Inter-Jewish Muslim Alliance, and the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, which is a project of the American Jewish Committee, coming full circle, and IJMA, the Islamic Council of North America. ISNA, excuse me, ISNA, not IJMA, ISNA. Now, beyond myself, because obviously I'm not the only person who was influenced by his work, there have been enormous changes in churches, certainly at the leadership level of churches. In many cases, they have yet to filter down to the pulpits, the individual pulpits. Certainly, Jewish-Christian dialogue has been institutionalized for 50 years now. And as a result of that, you see much more of the two communities working together to address issues. I have no question that the Muslim-Jewish coalitions, and I just mentioned that I work with two of them, are influenced by what Marc did, because there are many issues around which Jews and Muslims can make common cause. And while there's one serious issue on which they don't agree, which is Israel, there are many other issues in which they have a common interest. So the ripples go on and on and on and on. And they continue through our son, Joshua Marc, who himself has been involved in interreligious work.
So I would just throw out an observation that many Jews and many Muslims have found room for agreement on questions around Israel on either end of that debate. But we have an interesting question here from my colleague Ben Sachs, our Jewish scholar, who has done a lot of work on Heschel, and he pointed out that Heschel was drawing heavily on the Hasidic tradition, on Jewish mysticism, on existential philosophy in his life and work. Can you talk about, for Marc, what were his inspirations, and who were the people that he cited, either drawing from the Jewish tradition or just the philosophical traditions? Kind of what were his kind of anchor points intellectually?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to cite the big anchor point, and that was Heschel. Marc and Heschel had a very interesting relationship. Heschel was on the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary when Marc was a rabbinical student there. And he became very close to Heschel. And that closeness was triggered by a chance meeting in the elevator. Marc happened to be in the elevator. Heschel walked in, and Heschel could see that Marc was very troubled. And he asked him why he was so troubled. And Marc's father had just had a heart attack, and he was feeling very guilty because he was not in Baltimore to help. Heschel immediately called Marc's mother. And his mother, of course, was over the moon, having heard from the great Heschel. So that was the start of a very close friendship. Heschel was absolutely Marc's mentor until Marc was ordained. After Marc was ordained, he became Heschel's mentor because he's the one who brought Heschel into his life of activism, for which Heschel became so well known. Not only that, but Marc, right after being ordained, actually went into publishing. And he brought to his publisher, Henry Schumann Company, Heschel's first book that was written in English. He commissioned the beautiful engravings that are in the book, which is "The Earth is the Lord's." That's the name of the book. And that became another kind of launch pad for Heschel. But Marc, as I said, brought Heschel into Vatican Council II. He brought him into the civil rights movement. He brought him into a couple of presidential commissions on which he served. So it was an interesting relationship that evolved over time. Now, in terms of other intellectual touchstones, Heschel was the single greatest individual influence, but Marc was a historian. So he looked at everything through the lens of history.
We have a question.
Could I say
oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes.
I'm sorry. This just popped into my head. But one more Heschel story. When Marc died, once Joshua was old enough to go to preschool and then kindergarten, I needed to make a decision about whether to send him to a Jewish day school or to a secular school. And the only Jewish day school to which I applied was the Heschel School, because I thought in Marc's absence, with Marc not there to give him his Jewish identity, the Heschel School was the right place for him, because the tagline, which I always use for the Heschel School, and I think they should adopt it, they teach Jewish identity without Jewish insularity. And that really describes what Marc was all about.
We have a question here from Marlene Adler. She points out that with the polarization of society through politics and philosophical ideologies right now, she's asking on a practical level, what can people do as individuals to be effective activists in debunking misinformation and disinformation and improving dialogue and mutual respect? What, maybe either from your own life or from Marc's life, what are some lessons in being an effective individual activist who might not be working with kind of global organizations or national organizations?
I think it's easy to do these things on an individual level. First of all, we've got both the great benefit and the great curse of social media today. We should employ social media to go viral with counter propaganda in terms of all the hate speech that we have. It's very important that we find common cause with the other. Finding common cause takes you a long way. If you can identify those issues that are of concern to whatever your other happens to be, if you're a Jew and your other is a Christian, if you're a Muslim and your other is a Hindu, identifying those issues, those interests you have in common. Don't start with the differences. You have to start with what you have in common and then build on that before you get to addressing the differences. Also, if you're going to engage in dialogue, probably the most effective way to bridge differences is through joint action. Find a project that you can do in common. Marlene, who posed the question, is one of our senior people at the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. She pretty much runs the place. And as Marlene knows, we were able to actually forge partnerships between Syrians and Israelis, sworn enemies, who rose above politics and mutual suspicion to work together to alleviate terrible suffering. Likewise, when we hold packing events and they're interreligious events, at one table you can see a Hindu, a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, and they're there to work together to pack up emergency supplies for Syrians, Syrian war victims. So those are just a couple of examples. I could go on, but I won't.
So this next question, I think, will draw on your sociology degree here. It's a question from Robert Stuckey, and he's talking about that behind people's fear and hatred, there's often pain and trauma, experiences of pain and trauma that cause them to then lash out defensively. And I think we could even talk about that at a communal level as well, right? And we think about, right, the Jewish-Christian relations aren't fraught in some abstract way, right? There are these experiences that the Jews have had of Christians persecuting them, of Christian hatred, of kind of this long legacy of the charge of deicide, as you mentioned, the blood libel, all of these things, right? And so his question then is, should we be trying to discover the nature of the original trauma if we then want to heal those wounds? Do we start in the present, or do we need to do some of that?
Yeah, so Robert, Sociology 101. Here's what I learned in Sociology 101, and I'll never forget it. That the most effective way to debunk stereotypes and get past misconceptions and prejudice is through contact and communication. And through contact and communication, you do eventually get to the pain that may be the cause of the actions that you're seeing on the surface. So I have a very succinct answer to that one. See, I can do it if I need to.
So I'm conscious of the time, and I know our lunch hour is ending here. Just real quick, Georgette, is there anything else from Marc's life or his legacy that you feel like has just been has not been brought into the light as much, right? Because so much of what is the work that this biography is doing is to tell these untold stories that in some ways are the backdrop of this very pivotal moment in American history and in world history, but to bring kind of Marc's perspective, Marc's hidden stories where he was kind of on the backside. Is there anything else from his legacy that you would want to kind of lift up for the audience to hear about?
Yes, but not his exclusively, because I think what I'd like to talk about a little bit, since we have a couple of minutes left, is his 25-year deep friendship with Billy Graham. Billy Graham being the apotheosis of the evangelical Christian. Because I think that that's a relationship that most people are unaware of, and many who are aware of it don't understand it. But they were very, very close. They did a lot of work together. And Billy Graham was actually very, very devoted to the Jewish people. Anytime he would do a crusade in a communist country, he would call Marc and say, "Marc, what can I do for the Jews while I'm there?" Billy sent each of his children to live in a kibbutz in Israel as part of their upbringing. And he was also a very important back channel for Marc. During the Yom Kippur War, Golda Meir was pleading with Nixon for an airlift, and he wasn't doing anything about it, as most people are aware who were old enough to remember that war. Israel was caught completely unaware when they were attacked on Yom Kippur. Marc called Billy Graham, and Billy Graham called Richard Nixon, and the next day there was an airlift. So one might even say that Billy Graham was instrumental in Israel's survival. So Marc never forgot any of that. And he was engaged with a lot of evangelical Christians. I mean, we could do a whole other program on that. But I guess I would like to close with that shout out to Billy Graham and Marc and their friendship. And I hope that friendship is continuing wherever they are now.
Thank you so much, Georgette, for joining us today and sharing these stories and insights. For those of you who are not as familiar with the ICJS, we do these types of events fairly frequently. We've got 2 more book events coming up. On November 10th, we'll be hearing from Rabbi Rachel Mikva. She has a new book coming out. I think it comes out even a day or 2 before we're doing the book event. And the link is in the chat there. The title is Dangerous Religious Ideas, the Deep Roots of Self-Critical Faith in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And then on December 1st, we have Arthur Magida doing a book event on his book, Codename Madeline, Sufi spy in Nazi-occupied Paris. Very, very interesting story that he's bringing to the foreground there. So
and
those
and plug for this one.
And one more plug for Confronting Hate. This recent biography of Marc Tannenbaum and just the great legacy that he has left us with. So thank you again, Georgette. Thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we will see you again soon.
And thank you.